Yeah, I use the analogy of the game of 20 questions versus the game of Battleship. In Battleship, you can ask a question. It's like, hey, is there a ship at B4? And we do a lot of questions like that where we're like, hey, are you a racist? And no matter what they say, we're not going to be surprised. We're either going to think they're a liar or that they're admitting, guilt.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. This is Brave New Work, a podcast about reinventing our organizations and the search for a more adaptive and human way of working. I'm Aaron Dignan, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rodney Evans.
Hey there.
On today's episode, we're going to talk about productive disagreement, learning to love and learning to have healthy conflict. But before we unpack that, I think it would be productive to have a check-in round.
I disagree with you. See?
Well, let's do it anyway.
We're doing it already. All right. So we will check in now, as we always do. Our check-in question for today is, what is the worst argument you've had at work?
So this one is related to a former business that I had that was going through a tough time. We had been acquired, and the business that acquired us was not doing well, and like shit was kind of hitting the fan around us. And I had a conversation with some of my day-to-day partners where their feeling was we should kind of jump ship, and my feeling was we should stick it out and make it work. And I just felt really alone. I felt really abandoned in the moment. And so the disagreement was hard to resolve because it really boiled down to like different perceptions of what was happening. And I wouldn't even say in hindsight that anybody was right or wrong. It was like a total values-based judgment kind of thing. But yeah, I remember being really shook by that and like sitting in the car and just like staring into space, wondering what it all means. So that's probably my answer.
Yeah, that sounds pretty bad.
It's heavy.
It's heavy. Yeah. Mine
but we're
also.
all fine.
We all made it. Mine was a similarly existential work thing at a prior company when I was given my equity agreement, and it did not reflect what had been promised to me when I came on board. It was very different than a lot of previous conversations that had been had. And I was not chill about it at all. I was not thoughtful or balanced. I did not take a walk around the block. I freaked the fuck out. And it was, it felt like a betrayal for real, because I had given certain things up to do this and obviously done so under false pretenses. Yeah, it was not great. It was not great. So both of those arguments might have been more productive if you and I had had some different skills at that time.
I think that's probably true.
All right. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's just start with why do we even need disagreement, Aaron?
So I find this one interesting to explore because I'm not very good at it. Like I wouldn't hold myself up as like an example of great disagreeer or great conflict mediator. And so when I think about this question, I sort of have like the theory-based response, and then I have like my emotional response. And my emotional response, by the way, like from the check-in question on, is like, but I want to get good at it, so I'm here. Like I'm present to learn. And I think the theory-based response is when we know that we're navigating complexity, where there's a lot of dynamics and a lot of change and a lot of different kind of realities happening at the same time. We need disagreement as a way to do sense making. Like we actually need. If we don't have disagreement, that means that the most likely outcome is that we're going to get it wrong because we're all seeing it the exact same way. And if we all see something the exact same way, either we're lying to each other, which is not great, or we have a monoculture of people that really do perceive the world in the exact same way, which is also not great. And so I think the real answer is like in complexity, if we want to know what is actually going on, and if we want to learn and improve and grow, both interpersonally and strategically and operationally, we need to disagree. We need conflict.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And it's so easy to be in a culture, in a team where things are just like smooth and swimming along, and where even the slights that could become disagreements in other situations get smoothed over because of good relationships or because of general philosophical alignment. But I think also in those kinds of cultures or those kinds of teams, you have a lot of blind spots because it's like it's all
Right.
smooth sailing until something disrupts you that nobody considered because it was an anti-pattern or just something that you were not looking out for at all, which has definitely happened to me.
Right. And I remember, I think it was in a Brad Pitt movie, World War Z, maybe. They introduced this concept from the Jewish culture of the 10th man, which I don't even know if that's apocryphal or not. But the idea was like when 9 people in that culture agree on what's happening at, in a position of power around a big decision, the 10th person has to disagree just to provide some, countervailing force.
Right.
And I think that's really interesting, like a required disagreement. Like somebody's
provocation.
gotta challenge us a little bit.
Yeah.
So given that it's important, I think the biggest question is why, and this is true. I'm asking both for you and me and for the Ready and for culture at large. Why is disagreement so hard for us?
The short answer is I don't know. And I'm going to be curious to get other perspectives on this. I noticed that disagreement and productive conflict seem especially difficult in American culture. When I visit other countries or when I work on projects with companies based in other places, I do find a lot of other cultures seem to be much less passive aggressive than particularly
Right.
American business culture. We did a project earlier this year with a Dutch bank, and it was so refreshing and also kind of startling that there was just a very high level of directness. And it didn't even feel so much like conflict. It just felt like disagreement. Like I say a thing and then you say a different thing that doesn't agree with my thing because you don't agree with it. And it was really refreshing in that project to just be able to have that level of dialogue and not do the thing that I see happen in American teams, not all of them, but pretty consistently, where somebody immediately is like, well, I think we're saying the same thing, or like, I don't think this is as big of an issue as you think it is, or like, I think we're talking
How can I get mom and dad to stop fighting?
Yeah, it's like, how can we like smooth this over to make the discomfort end? And there's a question of just like, why does it even have to be uncomfortable that you and I, who have completely different lived experiences, have different perspectives on things? Like that seems intuitively super obvious. But then in the room, when we respect each other, but we don't see eye to eye on something, it can be very difficult to just get through that.
I think it's because, at least in my experience, from a very young age, one of the main identifiers of friendship was alignment on how we see the world, right? Like you like the same band I like, you want to do the same thing on Friday night that I like, we play the same video game, we like whatever it is, there was like this, when we have things in common, therefore we are friends, right? Therefore we are connected. And the safety of alignment was kind of a big part of cliques and social groups growing up. And so I think when you translate that to a workplace where, for most of us, just given our lives and neighborhoods, like a lot of our friends, a lot of the people we spend the most time with and have the most connection with are at work. And then we go into a place where it's like, okay, now we're going to have a disagreement. It feels like disagreements are tantamount to disruption of that relationship, right?
Well,
like if you and I disagree,
exactly right.
Might we not be friends anymore?
Right.
And that's scary.
I think that's so true. And I have the feeling at least once a week where I want to say something to someone that I care about that is disruptive, or it is disagreeing, or it's a counter narrative, or it's something that upset me. And there's just another voice in my head that's like, don't like upset the apple cart, or like what, there's even a question that immediately comes to mind of like, do you want to spend your relationship capital on this thing? Which it doesn't feel like it should be. It doesn't feel like just because you disagree with me, it means you don't like me. But those things have gotten so wrapped up together. And in fact, I studied this model a few years ago that was really about acceptance, but there was a formula put forth that made a lot of sense to me in this sort of domain. And it was the idea that you can only be as courageous as you are caring or loving. And that most dysfunction in communication comes because people are weighing too heavily on one end or the other of that. And when I look back at a lot of my worst moments in conflict, I would say I was too courageous and not caring enough. I didn't I didn't hold the relationship as sacred even as I engaged in disagreement. And then I see a lot of people on the other end where it's like, I care about you so much that I am unwilling to courageously tell you that I think you're wrong.
Right. And this kind of connects to the feedback episode that we have recently recorded, which, there's like the act of how we give and receive feedback. And then there's this sort of, which is part of, I guess, this bigger narrative about disagreement in general. And I guess not all feedback has to be a disagreement necessarily, but there's a Venn diagram here somewhere. Have you ever had someone, or do you have someone in your life now with whom you can have productive disagreement, just that you've found your way there and it just seems like the steady state reality?
There are a couple of people. I would say my husband and I disagree about things all the time. It's become like a relationship meme. We've been married for a long time. And like the joke is that if you take Ed and I to any street corner in any city in the world and tell us the destination, we will turn in opposite directions to get there.
Right.
Our end state is always aligned, and our care for each other is always aligned. And our method for getting to the end state is usually diametrically opposed.
I totally get that. And in some ways, my relationship with my wife, Britt, is similar. And I don't know if I've mentioned this to you on the podcast, but we have this thing that we've realized we do now after being together for literally 20 years, where if I take a stance, she'll take the other stance. And if she takes a stance, I'll take the other stance. And we'll usually end up agreeing. We literally, I think, do it because it makes the decisions better.
Yeah.
Like we are doing that 10th man thing, except we're the second man and woman.
Right. Yeah.
It's really weird. And it's really not conscious.
No.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's like you just want to like be a little bit provocative. So I think that's really true of Ed. The other person that I have that with is Allie, who's one of our team members. I've known Allie for a really long time. This is the second company we worked at together, and I really trust her very deeply, and I care about her very much. And I can just ask her to be really honest with me, and she will tell me the straight shit, even when she doesn't think I want to hear it, and she's probably right. And so I really rely on her as a foil in our work to be like, you need to tell me if I'm being crazy. And she really does. And we really will wrestle with something where both of us are like not easily satisfied in our work with our work. And I think it's really productive to have oppositional views on things a lot of times.
The thing I take away from that, and what's really itching me, is it seems like when you ask that question to people, the answer is usually someone I have known or worked with or lived with for a long time.
A long time.
And the thing I'm really sitting with that I want to ask our guest is, can I short circuit that? Because I'd really like to get there faster.
Yes.
I don't want to have to be with you for 10 years to be able to have that state. And I'd love to figure out how to access that.
So just to switch gears a bit, we work in a self-managing system at the Ready, and we help other organizations move in that direction. What do you think is different or similar about conflict in a self-managing system versus in a traditional hierarchical kind of paradigm?
Well, I think in a traditional environment, you obviously have a tiebreaker or someone to intervene or deal with the conflict in most cases, where you can just look up the ladder somewhere and someone will deal with it for you. So I think that is present. There's still a lot of conflict at parallel, two different directors, two different groups, what have you. So I'm not to say that there isn't any, but it has a way of getting resolved that's maybe more autocratic. And I'm not sure that actually resolves it, to be honest. I think that moves us forward with a decision or an outcome, but it doesn't necessarily find connection and real production between those 2 points of view. In the self-managed system, I think we struggle from the opposite problem, which is there's not always a place to go. In fact, usually there's nowhere to go. You're kind of just with your conflict. And what I hear us doing a lot is we air our disagreement or our conflict to the group and kind of let it linger, like who will solve this for me?
Right.
And then of course we come to realize very quickly, like, oh yeah, it's me. And I have to either go have that conversation or go have that disagreement and try to get something out of it. So I think that is true. I also think, though, that we have mechanisms, like, for example, the way we govern the firm and create our working agreements is a disagreement mechanism. Like it is that process, the way we collect reactions and objections and things like that, that does integrate perspectives, and it does do the work of productive disagreement, I think. It's certainly not the only way, and it's not the most fluid way to do it, but it does do that work. So I think we have some tools in place to help with that. But I think what tends to happen is, because we're self-managing and self-organizing, is people, to your point, kind of pick their battles quite literally. Like when is it worth it? When do I want to expend the energy, the capital, et cetera? And I think the aspiration would be that we get better at viewing the disagreement and the conflict as something that is inherently productive, that is generative. And so, I know, for example, when we created our quote unquote conflict resolution process, one of the people in the firm was like, no, let's not call it that. Let's call it the conflict transformation process, right? Because it brands it as like we're transforming it into something else. And I think that is the aspiration, but I don't know that that's always the lived reality.
Right. Couple things that occurred to me as you were talking. One is, I just last week coached a Duke program, as I do a few times a year. And so I looked at a lot of assessments. And, I've looked at hundreds of 360 assessments in my career as a coach. And almost always, the lowest category of raters is who?
Your peers.
Always. It's always your peers. And for all of the reasons that we know, right? Like, we're in competition with them. And in some ways we're working on misaligned incentives. And in some ways we have competing agendas. Like, there's a whole bunch of stuff wrapped up in there. It's like it's the sibling layer. And in self-management, of course, there's an implied power structure. Of course, there are different levels of experience, but on a project, we are peers. Like it is not like it is my decision how this project goes, and Allie just has to do what I say. Like, I have more experience. She does defer to me on some things. And if she really strongly feels that I'm wrong about something, I don't get to just say like, no, it's this way. What I see in a lot of projects, and particularly in our space, because we are in a young space where there's not a playbook that's repeatable, that's like, this is the one way to do this. What you see in a lot of duos and trios is people who are like, we have differing opinions. We're all pretty sure ours is right. And there's not a way necessarily to figure that out.
And in some ways, that's just the macrocosm of what is happening in the micro, which is, even if just one of us was just doing what we wanted to do, we still don't know if it's right.
That's right.
Just because we have a direction doesn't mean we have the correct one. And back to complexity, my response to that is like, great, you should do one of them and find out how it goes. And then, if it didn't go well, next time do the other one.
That's exactly.
And if you have to flip a coin, then flip a coin. And of course, you could also, use some kind of a decision-making protocol to evaluate those options more carefully. And so I think that's possible too. But the point being, like, even when you all agree what to do, that doesn't make it right. That just means 3 random people agree what to do.
Exactly. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was, having gone through the conflict transformation process that we created, I think only one time, what about it worked and what about it did not?
Well, I think the thing that works is if you have a way of handling conflict or things that are disagreements that need to be dealt with or mediated to move forward, then at least you have a path to walk that everyone's consented to. So just saying, this is how we do this, and the first step is this, and the second step is that. And in our case, our process is actually a set of different processes leading to what is ultimately some mediation and arbitration. But like the earlier phases are like, have you checked in with yourself? Are you thinking straight? Where are you coming from? And then maybe having a conversation with the person and actually trying to have productive disagreement using some of the tools, right? So I think there are different levels to that path. But what worked is we know where we're at on the rails, and we know what happens next if we can't find a way through. And so that is quite helpful. What is really hard about it is that, and this is true of almost any process or training regimen, is it's only as good as you when you do it. So like, how do you show up to that? If the first step is check in with yourself, well, you can do that at a Dalai Lama level, or you can do that at like, oh no, I'm fucking right, and moving on. Like you can show up to that differently. And so I think that that's the gap, or that's the place where it's wanting, is how well do we do it, and how well do we do it for each other?
Yeah. So I feel like at this point, it could be useful to have another voice in the mix. And I was thinking that the perfect guest to talk to us about this would be Buster Benson. He is the author of Why Are We Yelling? The Art of Productive Disagreement. So when we get back after the break, we will be joined by Buster.
Thank God. Ready, set, go. Hey, everybody. We're back with Buster Benson, author and co-founder of 750words.com. That's the number 750words.com. Buster, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
So tell us a little bit about what you did before you wrote this book, this Why Are We Yelling book, that led to the genesis of it. Why write a book about disagreement?
So before I wrote this book, I had spent 20 plus years in the tech world as a product manager, engineer, designer, various roles from large companies like Amazon, Twitter, and Slack to my own smaller companies. And my most recent job was at Patreon, building out the product there. And so the reason I wrote this book was because as a product thinker, as a product builder, and as like a organizational sort of design person, you're always working with people trying to bring their disparate interests and sort of incentives into alignment with each other so you can actually get something done. And it was only after realizing that the skill had been brewing in me for a while that I realized it was also applicable to every kind of conversation or disagreement that might happen, whether it's political or between friends or relational. So it just turns out that disagreement is everywhere.
Well, you picked a good time for disagreement, because I feel like it is present in the culture, political, economical,
yes,
social.
I doubt it's going to go anywhere anytime soon either. So
you talk a lot about productive disagreement. So tell us what you mean by that, and how do we get more of that in our working lives?
Yeah, a productive disagreement is, we often think about the purpose of a disagreement being, to be right, to see who's right and moving on. I see productive disagreements as broader than that. It might be agreement, but it could be so many other things too. It could be learning something about the world that you didn't understand before, seeing a new perspective. It could be building a relationship with the people you're talking to. So like sometimes disagreement is the best sort of crucible for building relationships and trust. And it can also be enjoyable. And I think enjoying disagreement is something that we just have really lost touch of as a culture. And yet it's so there's so much potential for enjoyment and disagreement, because it's where our interests come to the surface and our passions, and we get to hash it out with people.
See, I want to know more about that, because I don't know if I don't know if I've enjoyed a disagreement in a while.
Yeah.
And I want to learn.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because you could think of disagreement as a sport, right? And if you go to the gym and you're like, I'm just here to, lift some weights, and it's like just a chore, you're not going to enjoy it. But if you go and do it for fun and you play a sport, you might still get just as much exercise, but you're enjoying it in the process. I see disagreement as the same thing. If you go in seeking out something that sparks your interest and your passion, you're gonna actually be able to enjoy it quite a bit.
And do both sides have to be committed to enjoying it for you to enjoy it?
Oh, no, thankfully not, because then it would never happen. I think one of the things about these tips is that they're all single player. Even though you're talking with other people, you're sort of the curator of the conversation as much as the other person. And you can steer things into a direction where you're asking questions that spark their interest, where you're, pointing out things that you don't understand about them and asking, probing questions that you might surprise you. All these things where you could do it even if the other person is completely hostile towards you to begin with, and hopefully flip that around so that, eventually you are on the same side.
I'm curious, Buster, we kicked around a little bit in the first part of this episode why we have come to a place where conflict avoidance is so common culturally. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because we just have not treated it as a competency to practice and to get good at as a skill. And so if you imagine, you're skiing down a mountain and you've never thought about skiing as a skill before, you're just going to avoid all of the good jumps, all of the good paths because you're afraid that you might screw up. But once you sort of see these like, oh, these jumps could be exactly the point of this whole conversation, you steer towards them. And so when you think about it as a way to practice having conversations, to get into the flow of a conversation where the bumps are part of the fun, then you can seek them out rather than avoid them.
I love that.
So since that's about perceiving it differently, are there other misconceptions about disagreement that you think are kind of foundational that we have to blow apart?
Yeah. I mean, so we sort of touched on what the fruit of disagreement are. It's not merely to prove that you're right. Obviously, we know that. But we've never really talked about, well, if it's not about that, then what is it about? And so that's where the enjoyment and the insight and the connection come in. But another big one is that we think disagreements are about facts and evidence. And I've found through just teasing this apart, having many disagreements with people, is that the facts and the evidence are often the least important thing in the conversation. More important than that is, why do you find this issue to be important? What are your values? What are your beliefs? Why do you care about this? Like, what are the underlying motivations that make you want to explore this topic? In a work situation, it could be, impact towards the customer, or it could just be climbing the corporate ladder, or it could be ending the meeting. There's a lot of different reasons why we might be using a conversation in a disagreement form. And then the last one that I think is even more important than the facts and the values is the proposals. Like, what is going to be useful from this conversation? How can we take everything we know and we believe and think is important and then do something with it so that we learn something and continue moving forward rather than being stuck in this, what I call arguing at the gate, like arguing about whether or not it's a problem in the first place. Well, let's just assume that we disagree about that and test it out and see what happens.
We've talked a lot about just the number of avoidance strategies that you see. And I think the sort of argument at the gate thing is really right on. So your book suggests that there are 8 things you can try to have better disagreements. Tell us a little bit about which one you found to be the most powerful, maybe which one is the hardest. And for our listeners, go read the book so you can learn about all 8. But for our purposes, tell us about powerful and difficult.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the first one is one of the most important and powerful because it's sort of the foundation for the rest, which is to watch how anxiety sparks. And by that, I just mean reframing anxiety and cognitive dissonance as an invitation to something that's important to you that you want to discuss, rather than as something to avoid. And reframing anxiety as a signpost to your values is so important. And once you see it that way, there is everything else becomes possible. So one tip I recommend is to just start a disagreement journal, where anytime you have a disagreement that goes poorly or that goes well, just, journal about it and sort of tease apart, like, what was it about? What were the values behind it? And by doing this, you not only start to reframe your anxiety, but you build the pathways so that next time you're, in an argument, you'll remember, you might not remember what are the tips I'm supposed to do here, but you'll remember, I'm gonna have to write about this later. Oh, wait, okay, so I can actually reframe what actually happens in my journal tomorrow when I write about it now. And writing about it oftentimes just like helps you practice those mental pathways in ways that if you just read a book, you're not gonna necessarily have as ready habits to go in a conversation.
What might you write down when let's say you had a disagreement that was interesting to you today? What are the kind of things you're going to write down and document?
I oftentimes start with, where did it go off track? So, what was the first thing that the other person said or that happened that made me get defensive or made me imagine a battle? And then think about, like, what was threatened? What did I feel was threatened by that person saying this or by this thing happening, and tease it back to the belief, like whether it's like, I value the livelihood of others, or I value, that my work is seen, anything like that, and start there. The second thing I would do is talk about, like, what is it really about? Like, what could I have said that would have gotten it to be about that value and not about whatever took it off track, because often we just end up arguing about something that's not even important to us. So how can we get it back on track? And those two things are the sort of habits I think that help you in the real moment of having a conversation eventually keep it on track.
Yeah, Buster, what you said about anxiety really resonates with me. And a lot of the work that Aaron and I have done and talked about is really using both like bodily sensation and then emotional signal to understand where you're at in terms of whether you're coming from a place of ego or you're coming from a place of values. I think even talking about how people get to that state is valuable, because I don't think we can take for granted that people understand really what their anxiety looks and feels and sounds like to them. Yeah. A lot of folks that most of us interact with every single day are not embodied and in touch and integrated in that way. So when you talk about that, like what the anxiety is sparking, how do you counsel people to get there and to really notice when their anxiety is talking at them?
Yeah, this is interesting because this is the active disagreement that we're now moving into, which is if you can help the other person understand what they're feeling anxious about, you've actually had the conversation. So asking the right questions about like, okay, well, what I'm hearing is this. Is it because you value that this happens? Or is it because, like, what is it? Tell me more about, like, what am I missing about your position that is causing me to interpret it this way versus the way you really want to be interpreted? And asking these questions is the path to navigating the conversation.
So it sounds to me, and I'm curious if this came up in your research for the book or in your own journey around this, but it sounds to me like we're echoing some of those nonviolent communication principles around, what are I feeling? What are my needs? What are my requests? Like there definitely feels like there's a connection.
Yes,
there.
That first chapter about anxiety is definitely has a lot of influence from nonviolent communication. Although one thing I would append to it is that oftentimes that exercise of sort of stating your needs and making the request requires you to pull the emotion out of it. I think it's important that we keep the emotion in, because that's the the slaloming down the slope part of it that's exciting, and so keep that interest but root it in, like, this is a value that I have. This is something I think is important, and not as I am angry at you for doing this. Like the emotion below anger or frustration or just that feeling of futility is usually something a lot more gentle and warm, and that's the kind of emotion we want to keep in it.
So then it sounds like even if you're operating at a Yoda level of disagreement, fluency, you still want some you're still in touch with emotion. You're not having these like emotionless disagreements. Yes. You're just feeling it and using it differently. Is that right? Like you still get anxious when you
Absolutely.
argue, right?
I mean, imagine a world where we didn't get anxious about anything. I think that would be a world that we've ceased to be alive in. So yeah, I think it's really important to keep the emotions in there. And, in fact, that's the whole point of doing them, right? The whole point of having these conversations is to basically find flow with our emotions and conversations with others so that we can actually talk about the most important things. If we have found a way around feeling any strong emotions about a topic, it's dead to us. It's no longer, the thing that keeps us interested in it, invested in it.
The whole notion of using emotions as signal, even that is so anathema in so many of the corporate cultures we see. The old sort of like leave the feelings at the door thing is still real. And I think I'll only speak for myself, but I am often caught off guard and surprised when I hear that language and that narrative, because it feels like so inhumane and so sort of old school to me. But you still see it a lot. I still see that a lot in groups where it's like, there's no room for feelings here.
Yes, they're always going to be there somewhere, and they'll turn into resentment, frustration, and even like unhealthy lifestyles and things like these. This repressing our feelings is causing us to become a depressed, anxious, often early, heart attacks, and resorting to alcohol and drugs and suicide. These things actually affect our lives. We have to let them out. And I think that the mistake there is that we don't have a shared language around separating that feeling of like responding to a threat and feeling angry or mean versus the thing that's below. That's like, what was threatened? What is that thing that you care about below the surface that needs to be seen and heard by others?
So in the book, you talk a little bit about asking questions that invite surprising answers, which I think is a cool trick for getting out of that loop of just like being too deep in the emotion. Can you talk a little bit about how to do that and how to do that well?
I use the analogy of two things: the game of 20 questions versus the game of Battleship. In Battleship, you can ask a question. It's like, "Hey, is there a ship at B4?" And if they say yes or no, and we do a lot of questions like that where we're like, "Hey, are you a racist?" or "Are you a mean evil person?" And no matter what they say, we're not going to be surprised. We're either going to think they're a liar or that they're admitting guilt. Versus when you're playing 20 questions, you're taking the entire world of things you don't know and trying to cut it in half with something and say like, "Hey, tell me, where did this belief come from? Or, why is this important to you? What am I missing about about you that would help me understand where this is coming from?" These kind of questions, no matter what they say, they're going to be new information. They're going to be something that you learn about that person. It's also going to give you a chance to move from feeling potentially anxious and triggered to listening for a while, buy you some time as they sort of explore this answer, and give them a chance to move from like this black and white world where it's like, okay, I'm just trying to win this argument, to like, actually, I just want to tell you a bit of context about where I'm coming from, and it shifts the whole conversation around. And so I think, of all the tips, this is probably the one that's the easiest to do and often the most effective. Right out of the gate, you could just say like, what am I missing about your life, your formative events, the things that happen to you that make this so important to you, and help me get there with understanding that perspective. Because you don't have to actually understand anything about it to going into it.
I'd love to hear a story, Buster, of a gnarly disagreement that you've been in that you were able to turn into something that felt like productive conflict.
Yeah, there's a bunch. So I could go into gun control, immigration reform, ghosts and spirituality, like all these different topics where I've had many unproductive conversations. Ghosts? Yes.
Let's do ghosts.
Okay, ghosts.
Yeah, because that's something Rodney and I disagree on.
Aaron and I have a lot of fights about ghosts.
Wow, awesome. I'm honestly, I have too. And this is why I put it in the book. It's like, if I can find a way to have productive conversations about ghosts, and I know this is working because I just haven't been able to. I'm very much on the scientific, like, oh, they don't exist. If they did, there would be some evidence for them. And, if they don't exist, how can you pretend they do? So what I did was I had a salon at my house where I just invited a bunch of people and so like, bring your perspectives on ghosts and we're just going to talk about them and share the stories. And we're not going to be about trying to prove if they're right or wrong. What we're trying to do is understand like, where is each person coming from? Like how does this belief help them in their lives? How is it formed? And just get deeper into the personal histories of these belief systems. And I had zero expectation to change my opinion about them because I was still locked in this, like, show me the evidence sort of mentality. What I came away with after doing this and sort of following up with conversations with people and just inviting more of these was I found a different pattern. I found that the people that believed in ghosts were really using this as a doorstop to mystery about the universe and saying like, I refuse to close the door to this belief entirely because I just don't think I'll ever know everything there is to know about the universe. And to that, and that framing, it became this language of like, this is how I talk about mystery. This is how I talk about the unknown. And this is how I talk about my own relationship with the unknown. And I was like, wow, that makes sense to me. This is a way to talk about something, because when I talk about mystery, it's really dry and boring because I just use scientific words and it's no fun. So I understand why this is more effective. And that, has actually, for me, led to a whole series of weird interests now. Like, I'm now into like tarot reading because I'm like, oh, these are just basically ways to bring affordances into a conversation to talk about the subconscious and the unknown and all these things. I'm like, I'm really into it now.
Yes, that's so funny. Yeah, you're mirroring our lives right now because Rodney is reading tarot right now. My wife is doing the same. Who's
on which side? Are you? What's a typical argument?
I definitely believe in the spirit world, and I believe that the veil is fairly thin.
Nice.
And you sound a lot more like Aaron. I feel like, though, what's interesting to me about the story you just told is that I feel like you came to the same place that we've come to, but in a like more positive and evolved way. Like I think where Aaron and I has netted out is that it's like, I can't prove to him that ghosts are real and he can't prove to me that they're not.
Mm-hmm.
So like, we'll just let it be there.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think, you finding that these people use that as sort of their connection to the other is a really cool way of thinking about it. That's not scientific. Also, side note, there's definitely a ghost living in my lake house.
Oh.
Aaron,
a good one or a bad one?
When you meet him, his name, I'm not sure yet,
cool.
Actually. He is very present and very large and masculine. And funnily, my husband, who can be a bit skeptical about these things as well, has been convinced because my dog barks at him in the night at the ghost. Right around the same time that I feel him.
The dogs sense the
dog
energy.
comes from the other end of the house to bark. So I'm pretty high conviction on this particular ghost.
And so one of the things I'll just add to this is that when you argue about what is real, I put that in the realm of the head, like sort of like the informational realm, where you should be able to look this up in a journal somewhere. Oftentimes, what I've found is that when you're in that realm, it's better to go to the realm of the hands, where it's about how is this useful? Like, what is this topic doing for me in my life that makes it useful? It makes me sort of seek it out. It could be about something emotional. It could be about sort of telling a story about the past. It could be about relating to, people who have passed, that were important to you. Or it could be about just like, being interested in the spooky stuff. So when you think about the pragmatic sort of purpose of it, it has all this other rich flavor that makes the factual evidence seem really dry and boring after the fact.
I love that. And to bring us back to work and to the pragmatic, away from the lake house for a second, what is your advice for someone who has been avoiding disagreement in the workplace and is now like, all right, productive disagreement, I want to start doing this stuff? Is there a slow on-ramp? Do we start with the journaling? Do we start with the questions? Like, what should I do tomorrow differently than today if I'm now ready to kind of try to get more out of my disagreements?
Yeah, that's really the most important thing to figure out, because it's just not viable for a lot of people to think about productive disagreement as something they put into practice. So I do recommend the journaling if journaling is something that resonates with you. Not everyone likes to write. So if you don't, going on a long walk and just musing about your past conversations, having another conversation with somebody else about it, sort of turning it into this under the surface practice into something above the surface, where you can now talk about it as a thing that you're doing, and just reframe it from, oh, I really screwed up that conversation, to, okay, that conversation was probably above my skill level. How can I, build up to it again, like by practicing on simpler ones or easier ones, and just see it as a skill. We're not going to expect to be able to play Moonlight Sonata on the piano the first time we sit down to the piano, but we could build up to it. And a lot of these productive conversations that need to happen, we're just thrown in the deep end. We're like, okay, now go talk to your racist uncle. And you're just like, whoa, this is way over my ability. Build up to it. Talk to your, slightly, conservative cousin first, and, build your way up.
So is there anything we haven't hit on that you think we should have that would be, important for listeners to know?
I think part of the hope that I have for this conversation and this sort of topic is that we all think of conversation as a skill, because we have to feel it internally before we can expect it from our leaders, our politicians, our bosses, our CEOs. We're not going to even be able to know what to ask them to do until we can feel it ourselves. And so I think that's really vitally important that we see this responsibility and take it very seriously, that we have to be able to model and feel what it means to have a productive conversation, so that we can then expect it from others above us, and who have more power, and that can actually materially affect the large parts of the world, because we have to solve some of these problems, and the only way we can get through it is by having these disagreements in a productive way.
Well, in this day and age, I can't think of very many skills that would be higher order and more important than this one. So that seems like a good place to draw things to a close. Buster, thank you so much for joining us today and for teaching us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Rodney, always a pleasure.
Happy to be here.
And a quick tip of the hat to Taylor Marvin in the booth for making us sound good. Brave New Work is produced by The Ready, an org design and transformation partner to some of the world's biggest brands. You can get in touch with us by emailing podcast@theready.com. We would love your feedback, your guest ideas, your episode topic ideas. If you like what you're hearing, a review would go a long way to ensuring that this show finds the people who need it. And thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.